Okay, today we're going to look at a super interesting interview with a Republican senator actually being forced to go beyond the talking points when questioned by Fox News host Chris Wallace. It's really easy to simply say, we can't increase the deficit. We don't have the money for things Democrats want to do. Where is the money going to come from? Now, of course, we know that they never ask those questions when it's about defense spending or war or tax cuts for the rich. We know about that double standard. But it doesn't matter, because if they're not questioned about those talking points, there are lots of people who buy it. Hey, yeah, billions, hundreds of billions. That sounds crazy. How do we afford this stuff? And if they're not questioned about it, they never really have to explain what they mean. And you get a lot of Republican voters who end up agreeing with you. Now, similarly, when Republicans say Biden's infrastructure plan is too expensive, it's not all really infrastructure, it's filled with crap. When they say Biden's job plan is just spending money we don't have, it's easy as long as you never have to explain anything. But when you do have to explain, well, okay, which of these things would you cut? Which of these are not worthy elements for this plan? Something interesting happens. First of all, they almost never have actual answers. And secondly, it throws them off so badly that they often end up exposing other garbage talking points that they also typically are allowed to get away with. So let's dive right in. This is Fox host Chris Wallace asking Republican Senator Bill Cassidy, all right, Senator, sir, which specific parts of the Biden jobs plan would you cut? There's workforce development, there's childcare, all these different elements of it. Cassidy has no answers and instead just starts slamming teachers' unions, and it starts to get pretty unhinged. Take a look.
Up on the screen, $100 billion for workforce development, $400 billion to care for the elderly and disabled, $225 billion for child care, and $200 billion for free preschool. Senator, which of those programs that I just put up, which of those programs do you think people in your state don't need?
Every one of those programs should be evaluated. If it's important, it should be advanced. It's not infrastructure. When people say, wait a second, I like this because we need a new bridge across the Calcasieu River in Lake Charles, I'm saying this plan will not give it to you. The amount of spending for roads and bridges is so low that, and split between 50 states over 5 years, you're not going to get your bridge. Now, we may need this. By the way, we just are restarting our bipartisan working group to come at family support for the dependent, children and elderly. But that is not going to give you a road and bridge. And that's what people in my state would really like to see.
Okay, so far, he doesn't say any of the programs are bad, but he says they're not infrastructure. But again, this is a jobs plan. They're all job related. And they are, education, developing a workforce. These are even, I would argue, parts of infrastructure in the 21st century. But then Cassidy says, well, this won't get my constituents all the things they want. This money's going to go to all 50 states. That's not really a reason to oppose the bill unless your expectation is that all the money goes to your state, but that's not how federal spending works. And it's not infrastructure, but again, it's a jobs bill. So far, this is the lightest questioning. In other countries, you would be ridiculed as a journalist if you didn't ask these questions. And in the United States, with these unprepared buffoons, just asking the obvious questions gets you to a point of realizing this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's continue.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, and we could argue, and I have back and forth with both sides about infrastructure, but there are a lot of programs that aren't infrastructure. And the question I'm asking you is, would you support the government paying for them? I mean, I looked into it. In your state of Louisiana, the rate of child poverty is 25%. 1 in 4 of the children in Louisiana are in poverty. And according to the White House, 42% of residents in Louisiana do not have access to child care. So wouldn't they benefit, forget whether it's infrastructure or not, wouldn't they benefit from these government programs?
So I don't know if they would. If you think about the main driver of elevating out of poverty, it's good education. Now, what we saw in the pandemic was teachers' unions keeping schools shut, even when the Centers for Disease Control said it was safe to go back. The president wants to give universal pre-K, run by the same teachers' unions. Now, if you're in Chicago and there's more money going to the school systems and to the unions, and yet they still won't open.
So he's asked specifically, child poverty is a real problem in Louisiana. Child poverty is a problem in the United States. It's an even bigger problem in Louisiana. And this bill helps child poverty. Isn't that something to be glad that the bill addresses? Well, I don't know, says Cassidy. Teachers' unions forced schools to close during the pandemic. Zero substantive engagement with the topics at hand. And then it continues to just be an alternate reality. Wallace shows Cassidy, the Trump tax cuts you supported. Speaking of spending, those tax cuts disproportionately help the rich, and they increase the deficit, which he claims to be concerned about now when it's Joe Biden. And Cassidy ignores the substance and says, unemployment rates were really low before the pandemic.
I want to take a look at those tax cuts. According to the Tax Policy Center, the average first-year tax cut for a household making less than $25,000, the average tax cut was just $60. The average tax cut for a household making $3.4 million was $193,000. And contrary to talk that it will pay for itself, the Trump tax cuts are now projected to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. Senator, of the 2 million tax filers in Louisiana, only 14,000 of them were paying more, filing gross income of more than $500,000. So what's wrong with raising the top tax rate to where it was during the Bush 43 and Obama administrations in order to help the working and middle class?
If all you do is look at first-degree effects, Chris, you can make a point like that. It sounds just like President Biden speaking to Congress. And I'm not accusing you. I'm just pointing that out. If you look at the overall effect, the aspiration of this Biden administration is to return to the economy we had before COVID, where we had record low unemployment, which means record high employment for African Americans, veterans, women, Hispanics, the disabled.
So after throwing in that shot about, hey, Chris, you sound like Joe Biden, because you're asking real questions, Cassidy tries to argue that deficit increase, thanks to Trump's tax cuts, is only a first order effect. And then, the second order effects would be that the economy grows so much that the tax cut pays for itself. It simply didn't happen. The deficit increased and then it increased more. And OK, then COVID hit. But we know that the tax cuts for the rich are not revenue positive, even in the long term. It's been studied for decades. And then Cassidy says, as evidence, look at job creation before the pandemic, but after Trump's tax cuts. Remember, once again, job creation under Trump was just a slightly slowed down continuation of what we saw under Barack Obama. Slowed down. His 2017 tax bill didn't go into effect until 2018, which was reflected in people's taxes filed in 2019. The timeline does not add up. Let's look at just the last bit here. And there does seem to be like a child crying in the background during this piece. That's part of the clip.
High school dropouts with wage growth disproportionately in the lower quintiles of the income structure. That's where we were seeing the economy really help. Now, that was all part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act bill. You can't separate them. And so if you want to say, my gosh, these people are making more money, why don't we return and keep the Tax Cut and Jobs Act? That's the flip side of the question you're asking. And I think that flip side is the part that should be emphasized.
But the argument is, and there certainly is some data to indicate that the Trump tax cuts benefited the wealthy and corporations more than they did the working and middle class.
Chris Wallace is trying, but this is simply going nowhere. They do not have answers for any of this. They simply move on to something else. Which programs would you cut? Doesn't say, but bashes teachers' unions. Teachers' unions are bad. Well, what about the deficit? Oh, yeah, but job creation in 2017 was really great. It's pathetic, and they should be subjected to this type of questioning in every interview. My sense is if this became the standard on Fox News, a lot of these officials would stop doing Fox News interviews. And indeed, my understanding is that there are increasingly Republicans who are turning down interviews with Chris Wallace because he's just asking basic questions that any reporter in just about every country would be expected to ask. They fall apart. The talking points never made sense. But if there's no pushback, in fact, sometimes it's not that there isn't pushback from the hosts. It's they cheerlead. Oh, right, of course. Yeah, right. Yeah, but Democrats don't understand that. But yes, of course, you're right, Senator. As soon as there's basic pushback, they fall apart. We'll have more examples like this on our Instagram page, which you can follow at David Pakman Show. The great Daniel Goleman will be joining me after this short break. Really looking forward to this interview.